I'm back. This is Al McFarlane. You're listening to Conversations with Al McFarlane, our Friday program. We call it the Healing Circle, and it features my colleague and one of our leaders in community, Dr. BraVada Garrett Akinsanya. She's the principal at Brakens Consulting and Psychological Services. She's the CEO, founder of the African American Child Wellness Institute. And we talk about health every week, health and uh, the developing our whole being, mentally, physically, spiritually, all the time. And we just keep bringing that conversation forward every week because it's an important one. And she believes, I think, that the more we can address our feelings, our situations, and put them in context, but also know and discover that we have value, uh, know and believe that our lives matter, our thoughts matter, our feelings matter, and that we are worthy of being here, that we can develop the skills and strategies to be productive, gainful, um, compassionate, excellent human beings. That's the mission. And how do we do that in the context of a social structure that has demeaned, devalued, demoralized, and dismissed our humanity? And the question is, can we expect them to undo what they have done? Or do we have to look within and find the wherewithal, the indwelling intelligence, the power that allows us to bring forth our own sense of creation and of the world, and with a fervor that vibrates or harmonizes and therefore changes other human beings and other living things as well. Dr. B, that's kind of how I'm seeing it. And I'm saying that, seeing and feeling that in us is a spiritual and a practical, uh, a, um, a proven power and a way of looking at life and in the world that is different from the social structure we're in right now, that I say that I'm reading is based on a hierarchical, patriarchal system that's rooted in and supported by a philosophy of violence.
Mhm.
Violence is presented as both the answer and the way, and that people
Mhm.
can preserve their capacity to create systems that allow the few, the minority, to control and make miserable the majority. That kind of is one way of looking at how the world is structured right now. A few people, they could be kings, they could be counts and dukes, they could be chiefs, they could be elders, it could be the Illuminati, the wise ones, the people that configure themselves into special uh,
Mhm.
in a way that that configuration otherizes other human beings. And if they're successfully otherized, they can be dismissed. They can be destroyed without conscience. They can be, written off. And so we've been on that otherized end in the social society that we're in,
Mhm.
social structure we're in. And I'm seeing and saying, I think we're saying that we must continue to develop strategies and systems that reflect to us first our true value and purpose as human beings. And when we really catch that on the inside in our spirits and our minds, it informs and is informed by study, by practical application of knowledge. This is not
Mhm.
hocus pocus, it's not spooky. It's a
Mhm.
question of study and of practice and of recognizing the systems and strategies we've used successfully in the past. And by the past, I don't mean the last 500 years, I mean the last 5,000 years,
Mhm.
to put our context. And then, and if we can think back to 3,000, 5,000 years, and we can, then that allows us to think ahead 1,000, 2,000 years. And if we can think both looking backward and forward, the step we take now in the next 10 minutes is a step on the path of a 10,000-year journey.
That's
Uh,
right.
Three in the past, or five in the past, and 5,000 going forward, but harmonized, attuned, uh, uh, cosmic, global, you call it universal or multiversal or pluriversal. All of those systems apply uh, paths that reflect the unity in diversity. You know, the product of weaving tapestries of all kinds of different things and different ideas and different experiences into a unified whole that benefits the all, that is the all. So that's what I'm thinking. And I think that I'm trying to put that into a look at how we ingest the data from the Oscar event. We're being consumed by, we are consuming stories and accounts on what happened at the Oscar night when Will Smith, for whatever reason, uh, slapped Chris Rock. And we're talking about that. But I think the talking about it is not to sensationalize that event or demonize those two human beings, but to explore and mine the experience for lessons that come out of and guide us towards being human beings. So, Dr. B, I'm going to hand the talking stick back to you.
Thank you so much. And I like the broader perspective, Brother Al, of looking at it, not just going backwards into our history and our origins, but also going forward. And I think part of it is every breath that we take is a new opportunity to start over. And when we think about the history that Sister Brenda pointed out earlier about Will Smith witnessing domestic violence, and the fact that he emotionally regressed to a space where he felt like violence was his only alternative. That what happens to us is when we lose all coping mechanisms, we resort to the primal ones that have held us for centuries. And before people had TV, Oscars, radio, internet, they had to face each other in conflict. And him doing what he did showed me, especially given that history that Sister Brenda just explained, it just showed me that his emotions had regressed to the point that he had no other coping mechanisms that were available to him at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it happens to us when we are overwrought with our emotional resources. For example, the thing I like to teach people is that our emotions are like a glass of water, and the glass can hold 8 ounces. And sometimes that glass is filled with bad water. And if that water is full of germs and not being cleaned out and is gone on from one glass to another without ever getting filtered, that water, the more you put into it, at some point it's going to spill over.
Mm-hmm.
Now, psychologists, we have a fancy word for it, allostatic load. That means the straw that breaks the camel's back, and people can only carry so much. And that allostatic load, when it gets overfilled with problems or emotional or external stressors, we are at our wits' end. And although what he said, what Crick said, didn't seem that harmful, was it pressed on top of other lived experiences or internally or even perceived internally that made it to the point that he couldn't hold it? And so as Black folks, unfortunately, we are often overfilled with negative emotions because of microaggressions around us every day. You go into a store with plenty of money in your purse and a good credit card, and they still watch you like you're going to steal a dress.
Tell me about it.
Right? So
Yeah.
that's an example of what we're seeing, and the survival mechanism of physically having to fight, that is always the least resort, the last resort, and the least effective because it's primal. So with that, I'll pass it to Sister Brenda, so because she gave me an amen. So let's see what she can share about that.
I wanted to piggyback on what Al said. And then I thought of you, Dr. B, when you were in the office, the doctor's office with your mother, and you told the white doctor that one day you were going to be a psychologist. And I don't think there would have been anything that would have deferred your opinion of yourself, that no matter what you had gone through, you were capable of doing exactly what you said.
Mhm.
And the way Al and I grew up, and Kamal and Bernal in that neighborhood, no one could tell us we weren't tough. Our teachers had just re-emphasized the fact of our history, and our parents had given us so many moral standards. But I think above everything, it was our faith that we grew up with. And we just knew no matter, and I mean, my parents had 8th grade educations, but they taught me so much. And it was based on their faith, because they had gone through so much as adults. Because it was like my father was married to a white woman, but she wasn't. She was just high yellow. And, you know, it was just, I thought of that incident. I could just see you. What were you, about 9 or 10? And you said, this is what I'm going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to Al's number 7 brother the other day, and he is very, very successful, but he's so grounded in what he is doing, what he knew he could do. And then I look at my boss, 40 plus years, under some of the worst circumstances, being a Black media pioneer. And Youssef, they talk about it all of the time, but there wasn't anyone to tell us what we could and could not do, no matter whether the discrimination was there or not. So was I disappointed? Yeah. Do I understand part of it? Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes thy cup runneth over.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to suffer the consequences afterwards.
Yeah.
Because we're layered, and those of us who have been in education, my heart's just crying for these kids.
Mm-hmm.
Unless we have a bunch of freedom schools over the summer, I don't know what's going to happen to them in reading and math. So those are my thoughts. I just think that we got down to some cores, and we don't understand the core of some of what we saw and what we felt, because I just had to flip it. I'm like Dr. I couldn't think of Dr. The woman we had on last Friday, and she was talking about being traumatized. She was your mentor, and the director of psychology at University of Minnesota. You know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Well, she opened up my eyes to a lot of things also, because she said, I knew that pain. Well, maybe we didn't know all of Will Smith's pain that would cause him to react in that manner, because he was crying when he came off the stage. It was like his heart was broken. He knew what he had done. He probably knew there were going to be consequences. But that cup just couldn't hold anymore.
Well, here's a comment from actually my sister Roz. Will needs to suffer consequences. Chris should not. Chris should be applauded for not feeding into it. We as African American people need to rally behind both. and make sure they get the care and support they need. We need to try to control the narrative for moving forward. What do you think, Dr. B? Thank you, Ross.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with her. And I think because now both people are hurting. And I always think about that. When somebody misbehaves, though, something happens to us psychologically when somebody harms us. Something happens to us psychologically. And it even goes back to early learning. So some of us got spankings when we were little. We got shouted at for making mistakes and doing things that were wrong. And the correlation between being punished or harmed or hit or disciplined is often affiliated and associated with personal responsibility for doing something wrong. So when somebody harms you physically and psychologically, it goes to that primal space where you first learned about right and wrong. If your mama told you don't run in that house and you ran into the living room and you knocked the lamp down and she took that strap and whooped you, or took a shoe and threw it at you. I don't know what the mamas did. I came embarrassed you like I was did when she told us don't go to a honky tonk, and we went down there to drink pop, and she came in with her pink rollers and a fluffy pink house shoes in her hand. That was more embarrassing than a whooping. So whatever parents do or whatever happens to us that makes us feel like we are being punished, it takes us to that space. And that's why both of those brothers are going to need some help, because Chris is going to say, my safe place has always been on this stage telling jokes. I can say almost anything that I need to say if it's in a funny way. And I'll protect myself because I'm little. He was really, really skinny growing up. I'm little. People make fun of me, but I can make fun back. And so when he did that, that was his safe space. And the reason Wanda Sykes talked about it, and even Zoe, I forgot what Zoe's name is. She's her dad. Anyway, I'll talk about Kravitz.
Mm-hmm.
She said, "Are we going on stage and hitting people now?" And so that safe space for comedians like Wanda Sykes, Chris Rock, and the ability, like Richard Pryor, the ability to speak their truth without being physically harmed. That kind of let that safe, it invaded that safe space.
Mm-hmm.
And it polluted that safe space. Because now when you get there, even though you're afraid the audience may not like your joke, now you can actually get hit. So, our guest pointing out the need to care for both of them, I think that was positive, very powerful.
Let me ask you both to unpack the question or the comment from Jabbar. I think you said that he wrote that incident has set us back. Mm-hmm. And so I hear that all the time about being set back, and what does that mean? And so I question the value of this notion of setting back, because to me, the setting back we are generally talking about is setting back our image in the eyes of white people.
There you go.
And I think there's a need to distinguish. It may not be that, but that's been the common understanding. And I think that part of unpacking the complexity of all of our relationships with each other and with others outside of our community, but other human beings, is to understand who and how we are accountable to each other. And so I think that we have to say, if there's a question of setting back, what inside our culture are we talking about that is being set back or being, retarded or slowed down? And I think we have to make it clear that unless we are, that we're not talking about how white people see us. Because I think us kowtowing, that's probably the wrong word, but kind of what it sounds right at the moment, us always genuflecting at the altar of white supremacy is a problem. And so for us to think that just cause we at the Oscars, we owe it to white people to act a certain way, that's an issue for me. But that does not mean that whether we're at the Oscars or anywhere else, we owe it to ourselves to be civil, period. But the motive is what I'm questioning. How do we make sure we attack or approach, not attack, but examine and approach and act out of a sense of personal, moral responsibility and moral authority that emanates from within us, recognizing that the standards that we are often forced to comply with because it's a social structure are standards that at their very core do not believe we are worthy or even that we are human beings. And so what do you all think, Brenda, Dr. B? What do you think?
I think it goes back to one of the comments I made on the show yesterday. And maybe I'm wrong, but we can't do what they do, not in the capacity where we are. And I remember Marvin Smith's comment about the biggest enemy that we have is apathy. And that's really going to show up in the November elections unless we roll out what we know that we're capable of doing. And as long as we're killing each other and we're not looking at the root of why, and our kids are being miseducated, and it takes Professor El Khatib to talk about that white dominance, the Western way we teach, because we grew up with cultural relevant theory. You know, we knew because our schools were named after our heroes. You know, we taught Dr. Peter Hayden. Oh, I just love him. But he was talking about Benjamin Banneker. Al and I went to Booker T. Washington. There was Crispus Attucks. Our schools were named after Black civil rights leaders in Kansas City. We attended D.A. Holmes, who was a minister and a civil rights leader in Kansas City, one of the first. So we were surrounded by things that I feel that our children need. But I think bottom line, we can't throw up our hands and give up. Mm-hmm. We've got to work and work and work and keep getting the message out there. I mean, but I still believe that had that happened to someone white that did that, it would not have been blown out the way it has. Maybe I'm wrong on that one too, but I just don't see that happening. I could see a Jim Carrey pulling something like that and people would think it was a joke, but I just don't think it would have blown up the way it did. So that's my thought. I don't know.
And I want to jump in with the talking stick, if you don't mind. And that's around, I'm going to piggyback on what you just talked about, that white people in this society who hold power, they have a different set of requirements. And I'm writing about a phenomenon. I call it oppression reactive syndrome. And what it means is that for every action, there's a reaction, right? And so people who are oppressors have syndromes that kind of identify how they operate, and people who are oppressed have symptoms that show that we are reacting to oppression. And one of the oppression models is around our requirement to work twice as hard to get what? Half as much. That's a lesson that we are taught early on. And it's always culturally relevant to white people. It's not necessarily we work twice as hard to other Black people. But in the world and in the world of power, we're taught that white folks, they'll let each other slide. They'll give each other a break. But if you Black, you better not mess up, because your mess up is going to be bigger than their mess up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that particular syndrome, I call that one the fly in the buttermilk. Right? We're the only ones in these environments a lot of time, and our mistakes are maximized, and our accomplishments are minimized.
Right.
And so that's what I think is the lowdown on that piece. And so in this case, that's why I think Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said what he said, because he grew up holding that in a space where no Black man like him had shown up very often to those basketball games to be centers and getting paid, quote unquote, as much as he was, because he wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. He was already a fly in the buttermilk. So he was outstanding. Same thing with Barack Obama. He could be a fly in the buttermilk because he wasn't just ordinary. He had to be extraordinary. And that's where I think some of the issue comes with us. Do we have the right to just be, like the kids say, all right? Can't we be all right? Not all right, all right. You know, can't we just be that? So I'm going to pass it back to Brother Al, who posed that question.
Well, and so I'm trying to put everything these days into the context of the stuff I'm reading. And I've showed you this before. I'll just keep showing it because I think it's so important. This is a book that I've just finished. But as we talk every day, and as I talk every day, I refer to passages in this book that are lighting my way of thinking. The book is called Wat and Shemsh, and the characters on top are hieroglyphic. Wat and Shemsh translates to the way of companions. The subtitle is Myth, History, Philosophy, and Literature, and it's by Aikwe Arma. And I'll just, and you can figure out how this makes sense to this conversation. It does to me because I have been looking at analyzing ways we order humanity and society. And is there a system, were there systems that were not driven by, based on violence, but driven by another set of values? So just the back, I'm going to read this while I share the cover. Of Africa's oldest ways of life and death, there are two. One, the royal road, irresistibly attractive to power addicts. It's lined with hierarchies, priests, armies, and bureaucracies. It gave Plato his liberal model for the slave-owning aristocracy, the template for imperial, colonial, and apartheid systems of social inequality. That kind of describes where we are today still. The Way of Companions, which is the name of this book, is more ancient, but it's been so long suppressed, it sounds novel. It values knowledge above power. On that intelligent way, no one is born superior, none inferior. It needs neither violence nor fraud. No person, gender, race, or tribe is discriminated against. It creates no unemployed, no homeless migrants, no refugees, no millionaires or destitutes, only equal humans. The Way of Companions follows the rational measure of, tell me if I'm right with this, Dr. B, Jehudi, or is it Juti? The Juti, right? Of Juti. The balanced justice of the Ma'at sisters and the loving solidarity of Asar. The ancient Way of Companions is the way of the beautiful ones. He has another book that's called The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. And so this brother, the writer philosopher, is proposing and posing that we have the ability to think back, to dream think, to intellectually think, to spiritually think, and to practically think back to ways we were with each other before, out of us arose the urge to take shortcuts. And the shortcuts meaning, you know what, if I train simply on the way of violence and power and find a few like-minded people that will exalt me, the leader, then that group will do uh, unimaginable things to exalt and to pursue and to contain and retain power at the expense of the majority. So the concept of a minority lording over a majority emerges out of this division or separation from the original system of cooperation. Now, these ideas reflect, though they're named as if they are people, mythologies, and the mythologies are simply compilations of observations that happened in humans over hundreds, thousands of years. And so the codifiers put them into the principle, the name of Asar, Ma'at, the Ma'at sisters, and other, what we call them, deities, but they're not. They're human beings, human experiences, deified. So the question is, if we once had a system that did not know deceit and fraud, that did not know violence as a strategy to overwhelm and overcome other people, and as a strategy to control and maintain power, what could we do? And you raise the question simply because you say, is it possible to do that again? Can we go back? And can we go back in a way that guides us forward? So all that again, Dr. B and Brenda, to talk about how we analyze situations like this relationship between these two human beings that one have reduced their transaction to a moment of violence as if it's a solution. Now we're seeing, I think, both of them are feeling guilty, and or sorry, particularly Will, from what he has said anyway. Anyway, so just thoughts. Joyce Johnson is watching on Facebook, and she said, what part, if any, did Jada play in this? And so, Dr. B, maybe you can talk about what part are we playing as consumers? What are we learning from this? What should we be learning in this? And how can the examination of this incident improve all of our lives? What do you think, Dr. B? I'm going to pass the talking stick back to you.
Okay, I'll take it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so my reaction to it is that it's twofold. One part is what would we be talking about today if we weren't talking about that slap?
Mhm.
What conversations are being left on the table that are perhaps more worthy of our attention or more urgent in terms of our survival?
Mhm.
That's one piece. The second piece is, what do we as a community, a collectivist society, people who are communal in nature, what is it we need to do to make sure that we are holding each other accountable for living our best lives and creating foundational support so that people have somewhere to go? I
Mhm.
think a lot about Denzel Washington being at that spot and him telling Will, when you're at your highest, that's when the devil is at his most active.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And that phrase from an elder in the field kind of woke him up to the abysmal behavior he just executed on that stage and before the world. So one part of us is left on the table where we're not talking about our Black kids, our communities dying of COVID, Black men getting shot on their couches in their houses with no knock warrants, Black kids not graduating. Those conversations would be present if we didn't have to talk about this. But at the same time, that is an elephant in the room, because when black on black folks who we look up to, who we admire, when they show us the most base, lowest part of themselves, and they show it to us, like my mom used to say, they tear their drawers in public because you know what's left showing. When they do that, because we're collectivists, it affects us all. And it's close to that I am, the saying that Akon saying, I am because we are, and we are because I am. And we hold that as a core value. Most of us do, that we're connected. That's why when we see somebody get arrested, we hold our breath and pray to God that's not a black person. And we know if they're black or white, because if it's black person, they're going to flash their picture on the news. And if they're white, they're going to conveniently leave it out. So we have all of these dynamic processes that we have to navigate. And so when I think about our own wellness, our first point is to be aware of it and realize, I believe it's true, that when you're at your highest, the devil is most active. The devil in you, not necessarily outside of you.
Right. Listen, we're out of time. That's it. That's a great way to leave it too. There's a lesson there. There's a lesson there for all of us.
Can I ask something real quick?
Sure, certainly, Brenda.
How do parents change the talk?
That talk about what doing twice as hard
that they have with their parents, and especially parents of young men. How do they change this where it's positive and instructive, and not just saying you don't do that, but why you don't do it?
I think you just said it right there. Have parents saying why you don't do it, having parents say we don't do that because it's a barrier to our success, and reminding the kids that they are destined to greatness, and that's why they're here.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm Al McFarlane. I'll see you next week. Thanks, Dr. B. Thank you, Brenda. Take care.
See ya. Next healing circle.
My regards to Yelly.
He'll get it. Thanks.